Welcome to Mackenzie's Tavern. Oh, hi Silver Fox. I hope you liked the Adventure Calls intro. I thought it was kind of fun. Very simple, very basic, but very fun. And of course, we are here to talk about a form of adventure, tabletop gaming. It's good stuff. It's good stuff. Now, I've been tabletop gaming for a very long time now. Um, if I actually think about it, probably 28 years, give or take. Maybe a little less, 25. It's been a long time. And tabletop gaming has never been more popular than it is right now. And there's a chance that someone, you potentially, right now watching, are interested in tabletop gaming, but you don't know anything about it. You don't know where to start. You don't know you don't know what to do. You don't know the materials you need, or what in this world you need to grab first. And the choices are vast. Oh, they're vast. Thank you very much, by the way. Um, After all this time playing games, well, I wouldn't call myself a pro, but I would definitely say I'm well experienced. And it's that experience that I'm going to give to all of you out there right now a light, a brief, a simple introduction to help you get started into one area of tabletop gaming. But before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about history. Now, there's a lot of different games out there. So you could play tabletop war games, you could play RPGs, you could play strategy games. There's board games, which are tabletop. Of course, obviously, a board game is a tabletop game, but there are really complex ones, and then there's really basic ones. And then you have the wonders of things like card games. And the card games, they are nice. But we're going to focus on one area of gaming right now, and we're going to talk about a classic role-playing game, which is pretty much a staple, and it's one of the oldest um, tabletop games, which could be considered a modern tabletop game. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the history, just briefly, before we actually talk about the game itself. Now, a wonderful man by the name of Gary Gygax, the father of D&D, um, created the International Federation of Wargaming in 1967. Now, Gary Gygax and some of his friends and colleagues who like to play these tabletop games, they got together, they created the International Federation of Wargaming, and that is the start of our story, as it were. But in 1968, the first Gen Con was held in Lake Geneva. Now, Gen Con is one of the longest running, or probably the longest running, tabletop gaming conventions. And there are still Gen Cons that occur. But of course, that was in 1968. That was the first Gen Con. And in 1969, Gygax met a man named Dave Arneson. Now, Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax would end up creating D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, and that would take place actually in 1974. So our history takes us from 1967, International Federation of Wargaming, to 1974, when Dave Arneson and Gary Gygax actually created and first published Dungeons and Dragons D&D. So that gives you an idea. This game has been around a while. So 1974, but then in 1977, the Dungeons and Dragons game was actually divided into a basic and advanced edition, and this is really where things get fun. They also founded a company called TSR, or Tactical Studies Rules, which went ahead and actually published Dungeons and Dragons until it was eventually sold to Wizards of the Coast, and I believe that was in 1998 or 1997. I have this in my notes here. So So yes, Wizards of the Coast purchased a TSR in 1997, and that really starts a whole cascade of growth. Um, Currently, Dungeons and Dragons is on its fifth edition since the 1970s. So you can see it doesn't actually change that much over time, but it does change, grow, adapt, and become different. And that fifth edition is, well, it's pretty good. I won't say it's my favorite. In fact, I'd rather play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which would be the second edition of the game. But all of that aside, D&D has a very long history. It's been around for a long time, and it's a pretty fun game. Now, I started playing D&D in the 1990s, and I was actually taught by someone who started playing in the 1970s. So, kind of that direct handoff of one generation of gamer to the next. And here I am to talk to all of you about getting into D&D now in the 2020s. Whew! That's all sorts of interesting and fun. I do have some fun little things up here. The camera's not great, but I just got some fun little props over here, which I'll talk about in a bit. But amongst those things is actually one of the most important tools that you need, and that's actually this. This is a D20, or a 20-sided die. Now, a 20-sided die is one of the most essential dice for playing Dungeons & Dragons. Yes, a D20. So, in reference to all the dice, and I'll just teach you some quick terminology. So, what you'll do every time you refer to any kind of die or any set of dice, number one, dice, plural, die, singular. Very important. A lot of people will usually use dice in the singular and the plural, but die is the singular term. Now, we shorten it in the gaming world to D, just the letter D. And then we actually go ahead and follow that up with the number of sides on the die to refer to all of these. So this is a D20. There are also D10s, D12s, D8s, D6s, D4s, and so on. There are actually a lot of different sides that you can have in dice. And what you're going to want to do if you want to get into tabletop gaming is you're going to need to get yourself a set of dice, a full set. And a full set will include the D20, the D12, the D10, the D8, the D4, and the D6. Now I just got those two backwards on the end, but nonetheless, you need a full set of dice if you want to get into pretty much any tabletop gaming. though not every single game uses every single die, if you have all of them, the chances of you being able to start any game goes up dramatically. So, if you intend to be a tabletop gamer, go out, get yourself a full set of dice. And not all dice are made equal, but all dice are good. I actually, on my table here, have a jar of dice. I actually have even more dice than this. Oh, yeah. A good friend is a friend who will get you dice. So yeah, and I actually have specialty dice in here too, but there's a lot. And when it comes to gaming, you do want at least one solid set of all the dice required, but the more dice you own, the better, because there's going to be times where you have to roll sometimes a lot of dice. Now, for a number of reasons, I can't unveil these books over here, because there's actually a couple of books here. I can't actually show you the covers. That's why there's a bunch of stuff on top of them. But when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, there's a number of different manuals, and the manuals themselves, though incredibly important, you don't actually need. Or at least not when you get started. As long as you have a friend who plays, you don't need the manual. But if you are someone who really, really needs to know the rules, I would suggest getting a player's handbook. And the player's handbook is quite essential in the basis of learning all of the rules that a player needs. There's also the Dungeon Master's Guide, Monster Manual, and then dozens of other books. But if you have a player's guide, that's more than enough for a starting player. Now, one of the things about tabletop gaming is it comes in many flavors, and these flavors are all over the place. But one of them is in regards to the number of players that you need. Some games you can play by yourself, some games you can play with two people. In the case of Dungeons and Dragons, you need at least two people, but you can have as many people play together as you can manage to get into one place at one time. And that's actually really fun. Most gaming groups should consist of anywhere from 2 to 5 people, but this is not a steadfast rule. It's just a guideline. But you're going to want to have at least 2 people, because this is actually a game which works in a very particular way. You see, you have players, but then you have what's called a dungeon master. So if you're playing a video game, you don't need someone to run the game, because you have the AI of the game itself, the code built in. But in Dungeons and Dragons, you require a dungeon master. The dungeon master's job is to act as both the world, the arbiter of rules, and the narrator and guide of the story. But this is actually one of the best parts, and let me just emphasize this. Dungeons and Dragons is a collaborative storytelling adventure. No matter how many people are playing, and no matter how zealous your dungeon master is, this is a collaborative game. The story is created by the players, the dungeon master, everyone involved. And you, as a player, will represent a single character in this adventure, whatever that adventure may be. And you have a lot of choices, which are actually illustrated in the player's guide. Choices that don't just represent, things like your stats, and of course your statistics are things like how strong you are, or how smart you are, or how nimble you are, fast, and things like that. But there's also other things. So Dungeons and Dragons, since the 1970s, has actually utilized a couple of very interesting and often copied aspects of the game. So your character is going to have a class and a race, and uh, I'll explain this as best as I can. Your class is going to be what you are. It could be a fighter, a wizard, a rogue, a ranger, and then a number of other choices. Because, of course, there's barbarians and warlocks, and um, so your class is going to be what you do and how you interact with the world. So you could be a ranger, um, and go exploring out in the woods and have lots of woodland skills. You could be a fighter and you could be very combat oriented. You could be a rogue, and classic rogues are pretty much kind of like a thief or a bandit, but they have a lot of other skills. You could be a wizard and cast spells. But then, after you kind of look at what class you want, you also have to look at what race you want to be. And in Dungeons and Dragons, that's things like elves and half-orcs and dwarves and humans. And yes, there actually are a lot of other interesting things, and there's actually a whole bunch of supplemental books. So you could be things like goblins or mermaids or a lot of other things, and there are things like kitsunes, which are fox people, kenkus, which are crow people, and I actually have published with the Dungeon Masters Guild a list of other supplemental races of animal people, like bear folk and squirrel folk and woodpecker folk. So I actually have a published supplement of additional races that can be played. Um, and that's available through the Dungeon Masters Guild. I will not furnish a link right now because I'm actually going to be updating that and expanding on the choices. um, so choices are pretty diverse. Now, there is going to be a change that is coming and has already started coming where they're no longer going to be using the term race in Dungeons and Dragons, even though, these races refer to various different humanoid things like orcs and elves and goblins and humans. They're going to start using, I think, the term ancestry or something like that. So it's something that only is a recent change, and um, they're also fundamentally changing how that works. I don't have the ability to talk about the new system, but I know that they're getting rid of a lot of aspects of that. And yes, there were a lot of leanings due to sensitivity and the usage of the word, and so I can understand in 2021 they want to update it and no longer use the term race, but instead use ancestry. And I think that's actually how the change is going. Um, and I can't give you too much information because I don't know enough about it yet. But I know that they're starting to roll that out, so probably within the next couple of years, um, that will become some sort of permanent change in Dungeons and Dragons terminology and how the game works. But all of that aside, even if you don't own a player's handbook, most of the resources can actually be found online. And you can actually go to the Wizards of the Coast website and you can get a lot of the information you need to start building a character. Now, barring that, you can also, of course, reach out. There's a lot of different groups online of people who play Dungeons and Dragons, and barring that, if you have a friend who plays, just ask. Say, I would like to play this game. Can you help? Um, the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons is quite high right now, and there's more players right now than there has been at any other point in the game's history. Want to play, but is it time consuming? All right, so does it take a lot of time? Creating a character can be done in probably 20-30 minutes, depending on how detailed you want to get. And then playing games, you might spend a couple hours, but you're not going to do it every day. You're not going to do it every week. That actually depends entirely on who you're playing with. And there's a lot of people who only get together, maybe once every month to continue playing their game. Now, with that in mind, there are people who've been playing the same campaign, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. There's people who actually have been playing the same Dungeons and Dragons campaigns since the 1970s. All right, and do you miss out if you don't play a lot? Like, digital games change so fast. Well, you don't. You don't miss out. Bear in mind, since 1974, there's only been 5 editions of the game. Now, if you compare that to a video game, you might have updates or changes to the game every few months, or even sometimes more often. Updates coming sometimes weekly or daily. And like I said, there's actually people who've been playing the same games, like with the same characters, since the 1970s. At Gen Con, the original Gen Con, not the original actually, I think it was the third or the fourth, some people got together and they started playing a campaign, and they have been playing that same campaign every time they get together at Gen Con since the 1970s. And to address that, does that mean characters die? Well, yes, your character can die, and there are choices that can actually be made by your dungeon master about how permanent that is. Now, in the 5th edition, death is a lot less permanent and doesn't stick as much, which does mean there's a good chance your character could be, slain in battle, but actually then be revived after the battle or in the middle of the battle. So there's a lot to consider about that. Now, if you have a group of friends or even just a couple of people you play with, you're not going to miss out on a lot if you only get together and play like once a month or maybe once a week or however often you could. I have played D&D with more or less the same people now since I was a teenager, and we do not play very often, so it does happen, and it doesn't happen very often, but we always have a lot of fun when we get together. And yes, you can definitely go ahead and do something like arrange a game night on something like Discord. Last year, for a while, I was actually playing online with a few friends. It didn't really stay up, but these things happen, and it's not a big deal. Now, even if you're short on time, if you can come up with a couple hours to play every few weeks, that's perfectly fine. And you'll have a lot of fun. Because, as I said, it's a collaborative storytelling game. Now, there are rules. You do have to roll dice, and you do get advancement. So your character also has a level, and this level advances as you gain experience over time. And that means new abilities, you live longer, you can fight larger monsters and go on bigger quests. So this is a progression game. You know, your character will continue to advance and get better and get new skills and get new equipment. And it's all played in the theater of the mind. Now, some people actually use things like miniatures on a tabletop for everything from monsters to their characters to uh, buildings, and some people get really out there with it. Now, I actually used to make terrain and sell it for tabletop gaming. And terrain is anything like little hills, buildings, castles, any of that stuff. And you know, you have a lot of choices. Of course, you can have like other cool things, like here's a griffin. You know, I would like to make terrain and sell it again potentially in the future, but right now it's just not in the cards. I did attempt to start doing that again last year, but um, it just wasn't the right time, and I sold a little bit, but not much. But that's not what our discussion is about. So we're going to get back to some elements of playing D&D. So there's something called a campaign. And a campaign is kind of a catch-all term, but a campaign is more or less your continuing story and its arc, and its many arcs. You can have many different dungeons that you go into, many different stories and towns, and you might take the same character through multiple campaigns, but the campaign, in its essence, is one large adventure. You might have many small adventures, and each time you get together to play, you're just playing another adventure in the overall campaign. And campaigns are much like if you were to watch a series on TV or a movie. The campaign is the overall story. So if you were to think about it like a television program or a streaming program, each episode would be like one adventure on the overall campaign, and then potentially each season would be a campaign, or potentially the whole series until its final run is the campaign, depending on the way the story runs for that particular thing. So when you want to think about the way you're playing your game, every time you get together to play a game with your party, that's one adventure. And sometimes adventures can actually take a few sessions to do. And the session itself is actually when you get together for that gameplay. So that's a session. So let's break this down properly. When you sit down and you play a game with your friends, each time you play is a session, and a session could run for a couple of hours. I've seen them run as short as half an hour and as long as 8 hours. It all depends on the group of people you're with, and obviously when I was a teenager, um, you know, me and my friends would actually play sometimes 8 hour long sessions because we'd get together on the weekend. That was the only thing we did, and then we would be upon our way. So a session is every time you sit down an individual gaming time. Now, an adventure is kind of a storyline in into itself. So let's use a good example. Say your party goes into a town and the town wants you to help them get rid of bandits which are raiding the town. That's an adventure. The adventure is actually saving the town from bandits. Now, if you can complete this in one session, well, that's a one session adventure. But if you can't, you know, you'll play as many times as it takes to complete the story. And one of the things that's interesting about a game like Dungeons and Dragons is when you get together, it's not just talking everything out, you actually are role playing. And because it's a role playing game, if your character is a dashing elf musician, you're going to pretend to be that dashing elf musician, and you're going to do things which are both in character and out of character. So when you talk to the dungeon master about what you want to do, that's out of character action. But when the dungeon master presents you with someone that you have to talk to, you're going to want to try to go into role play and then actually work out the conversation. There are going to be some things that will go down to rolling dice, but there's other things which actually come down to direct interaction with other players, or what's called an NPC, or a non-player character. And non-player characters are entirely portrayed by your dungeon master. So your dungeon master is everyone else in the world. So oftentimes they will put on voices, they will take characters up, they'll have a whole cast of people they have to keep track of. But when you go into a town and you meet someone in the inn or in the blacksmith and you want to talk to them, it's best to actually act those things out. Hello, blacksmith. I'd like some new shoes for my horse. I don't understand anything you're saying. You don't have to act it out, but it is encouraged, um, or at least going ahead and having the conversations. So having conversations is a portion of the game in the role play of it, as you are playing the role of someone. So when you go to interact with people, there's a great deal of encouragement to actually go ahead and interact with the NPCs as if you were really talking to them. Now, you can try to speed through this, and depending on who you're playing with, some people will go ahead and just cap it all off, be like, I'd like to go up to the blacksmith and say, I need this, this, and this. And then sometimes, if that's the game style that you're playing, it's perfectly fine, and the DM will just say, okay, Baba, kitties are being naughty. So there is some encouragement to actually role play your character, but if that's not something that you want to do, it's perfectly acceptable and can be dealt with. I'm well known amongst my friends, and have been for a long time, that when I role play a character, I am definitely in character most of the time, and I try to react to all situations as that character. And if I'm your dungeon master, I'm going to be going ahead and talking as your enemies and as your friends and as the people in the shop, and I have a lot of fun doing that. It's a lot of fun, it gets very interactive, and it's just a great time. So, go to the shop and it's okay. I'll address that. So it's less intimidating than you'd think, but I can understand that it sounds intimidating. There's actually a very large number of people who are using Dungeons and Dragons, um, various mental health professionals and whatnot, who actually use Dungeons and Dragons to help people learn to do interaction um, if they're not capable of doing it, which is actually really cool. Um, but you don't have to do that much acting. You can go ahead and establish who your character is, and then just have the conversations. So if you walk into the tavern, you can go ahead and be like, I want to go ahead and get myself an ale, and then you sit down, and then if there's other people in the room that you want to talk to, you'll know they're there. We will get into other types of games. There are many, and it's not that intense, but it is a great way to have a lot of fun. Mm. The core of the game really is adventure, and in many ways, you can play any way you want, and that's one of the great flexibilities of the game. There are rules and there are ways things work, but at the end of the day, in the actual guides that you can buy, it lets you know that, even the dungeon master, it lets them know that any rules or any things that they don't want to use, they don't have to. The game is designed to be very flexible and very open for just about anyone to come in and play. And I'm very happy. I taught my kids to play both when they were very young. So, oh, most certainly not. If you're with a bunch of hardcore players or long-term players, everyone has very different ways they do things. And I've played with people who just play it very straight and they go ahead and they describe exactly what they want to do. I want to talk to this person, I want to do this thing, and then they just roll if they have to, and there's very little character involved. And then there's someone like myself where I'm going to become the character and I want to have the conversations. But if that's not the way that the dungeon master is going to play, then you adjust to them. And it's perfectly fine. As far as intricacies of the game, it's actually really easy. And I would encourage anyone who wants to play to try it, to go ahead, give it a shot. Some people who didn't think they would like it then turned out to like it a whole lot, and then others who thought it sounded really exciting, they get into it and they're like, it's fun, but it's not for me. And I will come back and say this is only one of many different kinds of tabletop games. Some are more strategy, some are more action oriented, others are more role play oriented. And there is no one way to play many of these games. In fact, you can take heavy strategy games and you can turn them into story-based games if you really want to. And you can take story-based games and you can make them a lot more action-oriented if you want to. So there's a great deal of flexibility, and I think that's actually one of the reasons that so many people are playing now. There's more copies of D&D being sold now than there has been ever. And it's just getting more and more and more to the point where people are now, they're streaming their sessions. There's TV shows where you just watch celebrities play, and they'll just sit down and play one game. And as far as the pop culture to it, there's there's such a broad reach of different people who can access the game and have a really good time. And they are making a lot of changes to make it even more accessible to more and more people. So there's a lot of fun to be had, and the learning curve is actually pretty small. Once you get past the idea of rolling dice, everything else is easy. Once you have someone to play with, they can point to everything that you need if you don't know, and help you move along and get everything done. And realistically, you can learn enough about the game in your first session that you can just keep coming back and playing without a lot of worry. There are certain character classes which are easier for starting players, and there are certain character classes which are harder for starting players. Um, but that's the same thing is true if you look at video games. There are certain video games where certain choices make the game a lot harder if you're just beginning, and certain choices can make the game a lot easier. And so that's one of the reasons I would definitely go ahead and encourage anyone to give it a shot. And you definitely can go ahead and you can find groups online, and you can find lots of different people to play with. So there's no limit on the possibilities as far as what you could do. And I will go back and I will say, yes, there's role playing to the game, but that's not the most important part of it. The most important part is having fun. So I will always sit on top of that. Have fun. Just have a good time. Because if you're not having a good time, well, then something's just not working out right. These cats are gonna get behind everything right now. They can't help themselves. As soon as I get the green screen or anything up, they're just like, I have to get behind that right now. I know I shouldn't acknowledge it's a green screen, but it is, and they can't help themselves. As long as you can't see it, it's fine. Now, oh, good. Um, but let me go ahead and talk a little bit more. And this is really just an introduction to some really basic things. And that's the best way to start any one of these journeys, with the basics. So, obviously, you know a little bit of history now, just a little. You have a semi-understanding of how the game is sort of played, not a full understanding. And you don't even need a full understanding when you get started. All you need is the opportunity to grab any dice you have, or to go with a friend somewhere and get some dice, and then sit down and start hashing everything out. The actual building the character is going to be the first thing that you have to go through. And as soon as you've built a character, you can take that character anywhere. And I will say that even if your character should perish, you don't have to get rid of it. You can just reuse it in a different game if you want. There's nothing wrong with that. Some people who play will go ahead and make character after character, and that's actually pretty fun into itself, just writing everything up. And then designing your character and then bringing it into an adventure. So some people will make a new character every single time that they go to play, and others will go ahead and make one character and keep playing it until they don't want to play with that character anymore. So, there's a lot of choices. If you're playing a story-based game and your character should perish, I would encourage you to talk with your dungeon master about whether or not you can just give the character a new name and then just bring them back. And if that's not going to happen because of the dungeon master, well, make a new character and just keep playing. Does the dungeon master change? All right. For every different group of people playing, they're going to have a different dungeon master. So And if the group of people you play with wants to switch roles between games, you might have one person in the group be the dungeon master one week, and then another week someone else in the group can be the dungeon master. However, it is best for any single story or campaign to have one dungeon master throughout the entire game. I often will take the dungeon master role. I really enjoy writing games, running games, building stories, and then taking people on adventures. So I enjoy being a dungeon master. I enjoy playing, and I will happily take either role. But I have a lot of fun being a dungeon master and kind of weaving these stories together, and then taking a group of my friends on a great adventure. Um, it goes wonderfully either way. And I also have a tendency to bring back characters from previous games and go ahead and just stick them in the story because it's a fun little nod to whatever we were doing beforehand. Um, Thank you very much. Many people really enjoy me as a dungeon master. Others do not, but I take everyone's opinion for what it is. It's their opinion, and if you don't like playing with me, that's perfectly fine. Uh, can you play favorites? You really shouldn't play favorites, but if you have someone new in the group, generally you take it light on them because you don't want to go ahead and just throw them into something that they don't know how to handle or deal with. So a dungeon master also can be really good if you have an experienced dungeon master for helping lead a new player into understanding the game and understanding how everything works. So there is a wonderful balance. You're going to want your dungeon master and your fellow players when someone new comes in to, make allowances for that. Um, and oftentimes, when my friends and I play, so when I first started playing, I actually first got into D&D because of one of my friend's fathers, Mr. Q, who is on here sometimes as the troubadour. Mr. Q started playing with his brothers in the 70s, and that is how I learned to play from them. And Mr. Q's son and I, we played a lot together with our other friend group, and so that was kind of my introduction to D&D. So never had a friend play, no one ever asked me. Well, it's understandable. Even though the game's been around for such a long time, it's hard to necessarily say that you're going to be able to find a group everywhere. And there's many people who never played, and there's even people, who are just finding out about this game now. So, just because something's been around a long time doesn't necessarily mean you're going to interact with anyone who plays. And I think the same is true for like lots of hobbies, lots of games, lots of pastimes that people enjoy. You know, there's so many things that have been around for a long time, but just because they've been around, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've met anyone who does it. So that's actually a good place to look into local game stores in your area. Um, so should you be watching this right now, um, and not in the chat, or should you be watching this on the replay, or later when it's uploaded on YouTube, I highly encourage you to go to your local game store or local comic shop and ask if they have an open gaming night. Because if you go to an open gaming night, the chances of you finding groups of people who play, you can find a group and you can just ask. Or sometimes open plays will have sign-ups where you can just sign up, and then when you go, there will be like some tables set up, and you'll just go to whatever your table is, and then there's going to be a group of people, and maybe none of you have played, maybe a lot of you have played, but you'll be introduced to the game. And sometimes those open plays are run where someone who works for the store will actually run the game. It's a whole lot of fun. It just seems odd because I heard of it, just never been introduced. Well, I won't say that it isn't odd, and I won't say that it is. But at the same time, I'm happy to be able to introduce you to some of the concepts from the game. To talk a little bit more about how some portions of the game work, there's magic, there's combat, and there's dice. There's also a lot of interaction and adventure and travel. Generally, you're going to do a lot of traveling in D&D, and a lot of going from town to town, or castle to castle, or dungeon to dungeon. And for the most part, you can actually do it as an interactive story where you say what you want to do and then you do it. But then there's certain actions which will require the rolling of a die. Now, the D20 is actually one of the most rolled dice for D&D. Even though you're going to use all the rest of the dice also, you're not going to use them nearly as often as you're going to use this. This 20-sided die is actually going to be rolled for everything from determining how well you do in combat to figuring out if you can climb up an icy rope, hanging off a cliff. Can you outrun a mountain lion? Well, you better roll it. And to explain roughly the idea behind this, anything that is contested, you're going to roll for. So if something could be reasonably understood that you could actually just do something in normal life, well, you don't have to roll for it. But if anything has any sort of resistance to it, you're going to have to roll. If you would like to persuade someone to do something, well, persuasion in real life too requires some finesse and understanding, and it's not something that just happens. You can't just tell someone something and it happens. So persuasion, you'd actually roll to persuade someone. If you want to intimidate someone, you're going to roll to intimidate someone. If you want to do some athletic feat, you're going to roll. If you want to hit someone with a sword, you're going to roll. But if you're going to walk from point A to point B, you're just going to do it. If you're going to have a conversation with a blacksmith, you're just going to do it. And if you want to buy some fancy new clothes, as long as you have the gold pieces, you're just going to go ahead and buy it. And that actually is a really easy way to kind of explain how the game works. If you could be expected to be able to do anything in your normal day-to-day life, then you should be able to do it without rolling a die in D&D. If you're going to do anything that would require skill, finesse, or that would be opposed by some other force, you're going to roll a die. And that's actually a really simple breakdown of how that works. Now, the intricacies of how that die rolls, that changes a great deal, but we're going to stick to a very basic concept. More often than not, you want a high number on this die. And if you roll a 20, chances are you've done the thing. And if you roll a 1, chances are you haven't done the thing. And in combat, there's this thing called a critical. So if you've played video games, critical hits are in a lot of video games, and that concept comes from Dungeons and Dragons. So if you've ever done critical damage in a video game, you can actually thank Dungeons and Dragons for introducing this concept to games. And what a critical hit is if you roll to hit an opponent in combat. Let me just find where is it? Oh, I grabbed the wrong d20. Either way, if you roll a 20 on a die, so when you roll this, if it lands and the 20 is the number you've gotten, that's this thing called a critical hit. And a critical hit in Dungeons and Dragons is a guarantee that you hit the opponent, and you also do double damage usually. Now, I say usually because there are cases where you'll do more or less, depending. But if you want to look at it, the most basic concept, a critical hit in Dungeons and Dragons is when you roll a 20 when you try to hit someone in combat. When you do, you hit them and you do more damage than normal. So any video game you've ever played that has critical hits in the game, that's thanks to D&D. Now there's also the critical miss, which is if you roll a 1, no matter what modifiers are stacked on it, or no matter how lucky you are, you didn't hit. I'm sorry, didn't happen. And that's just a very basic mechanic from the game, which has carried over into just about every video game that was created for a long time. Now they don't do it with rolling a die; they do it with numbers or special skills or otherwise, or just being really lucky or really accurate. I can't explain that properly for a video game, but critical hits in video games work differently, but pretty much the same. Now, that in a nutshell is a lot of what you need to know. Now, it should be stated that also your stats or your statistics, like your strength, your dexterity, your intelligence, there's a few others, charisma, things like that. Those also range from 1 to 20. You'll very rarely ever have a character with anything less than probably an 8 for one of their stats, but those also have a range of 1 to 20. 20 being pretty much the best, 1 being pretty much the worst. There are instances where those numbers will be higher than 20, but that's usually for monsters or special situations or magic. Now, I do hope that you're enjoying this conversation, and I hope it's been useful. And it might not necessarily be the most all-encompassing or the most definitive conversation, but this is an introduction. And with this introduction, I hope that you are encouraged to seek out and get into adventuring, get into playing a tabletop game. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to have more conversations about more games because there's a lot of tabletop games out there and there's a lot of different types. But I would be remiss if I didn't discuss D&D, which is the the parent of modern tabletop gaming. It's the point where it comes in. Now, tabletop gaming has itself been around for actually centuries, if not longer, and board games have been around for thousands of years. So tabletop gaming itself is the oldest form of gaming, but modern tabletop gaming can most definitively be traced back to D&D. If If I am wrong on that, though, please feel free, because this is going to be up on YouTube. So if you're watching this on YouTube later, please feel free if you have additional information. I'd be happy to learn. Feel free to put comments down below and let me know. Now, for the stream, there's a cat right over there by the table. Can't help himself. Can't help himself. Now, for the stream itself, if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer anything. And if you're watching this later, after it's been uploaded to YouTube, and you have any questions, please feel free to comment down below. I think this is one of the first times I've just drank the horn the entire show and not just like emptied it out right away. Or, you know, pretty quickly. So that's great. All right. But if there's no questions or anything to get into, what I'm actually going to say is this has been our conversation about tabletop gaming, an introduction to D&D and an introduction to tabletop gaming. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a series of these, both as live stream and as videos uploaded to YouTube. And we're going to continue diving into, discussing, breaking down, and even getting into some nitty-gritty topics about tabletop gaming and its various types. But I would like to thank you for being here. Remind you to be excellent, my friends, because you are. And I'll leave you just with this nice little visual. This little spider, when I got it, well, it's a giant cave spider. Either way, this little thing, it went ahead and it did a lot of damage to my friends. Because, of course, I was the dungeon master and I had a few of these on the table. You do not want to fight a giant spider. Now, thank you for being here. I will be back tomorrow morning at around 7:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time for a few minutes of fun by the river. So if you're watching this on YouTube later, go over to Twitch, follow Your Saturday Night to follow all of my live streams. And if you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for being here. And you should still go over, and you should still go over to Twitch and follow Your Saturday Night. All right. So thank you for being here, and I am out. And this has been a whole lot of fun.